The Kennedys. The name itself just conjures up these images, right? Power, wealth, charisma. For decades, they were America's ultimate dynasty. But if you look just behind those famous, glamorous photos, there's a much darker story. A story of tragedy that is so relentless, it's almost unbelievable. It's so dramatic, you can't help but ask the question, was this family just incredibly, unbelievably unlucky? Or is there something else going on here? They were the closest thing America has ever had to a royal family, but their story reads more like a classic Greek tragedy. So let's get into it. All right, so to really get our heads around this whole curse idea, we've got to look at the actual pattern of loss that just seemed to follow this family everywhere. And it starts with a tragedy that for decades was a deeply buried family secret. And here's where it gets really dark, really fast. The first major tragedy to strike the Kennedy children wasn't a plane crash or an assassination. Nope. In 1941, the family patriarch, Joe Kennedy Sr., made a choice. He was worried his 23-year-old daughter Rosemary and her, let's call them, mood swings, might hurt the family's image and political future, so he secretly authorized a prefrontal lobotomy. The procedure was an absolute disaster. It left Rosemary institutionalized, essentially hidden away for the rest of her life. And after that hidden tragedy, the public losses started coming, and they didn't stop. It was just brutal. First, Joe Jr., the golden boy, the one everyone thought would be president, he dies in a top-secret mission during World War II. 4 years later, his sister Kik dies in a plane crash. And then came the two big ones, the events that would change America and cement this story forever. The assassination of President John F. Kennedy, and just 5 years after that, his brother Robert. Think about that. 4 of the 9 Kennedy kids all gone, all in sudden, violent ways. I mean, JFK's assassination in Dallas in 1963, it was more than just a national tragedy. It was a trauma for the entire country. And really, this was the moment that planted the first seed of this whole myth. It just felt wrong. This young, charismatic president, a symbol of hope, gone just like that. It felt like the world had been knocked off its axis. And just when the nation was starting to heal, the unthinkable happened. Again. It's 1968. Robert F. Kennedy has just won the California presidential primary. He's celebrating, it's a huge moment, and he's assassinated, right there in Los Angeles. Look, if JFK's death was a shock, RFK's death, that felt like a pattern. It was the moment that really cemented this idea in people's minds that some kind of dark cloud, some terrible, unavoidable fate was just hanging over this family. And believe it or not, the tragedies didn't even stop there. The next generation, they inherited this crushing weight. Robert Kennedy's son David, who, get this, actually watched his own father's assassination on live TV as a little boy, he later died of a drug overdose. His brother Michael died in a totally reckless, high-speed skiing accident. And then, the one that for many people felt like the final heartbreaking chapter, John F. Kennedy Jr. The world knew him as John John, the little boy who gave that heartbreaking salute at his father's funeral. He died along with his wife and sister-in-law when the plane he was piloting crashed into the ocean. So, okay, you hear all that, and it's pretty easy to see why the word curse started getting thrown around, right? But here's the really wild part. Where did that exact idea, the Kennedy curse, actually come from? Well, the answer is pretty fascinating because it came from inside the Kennedy family. It starts with Jackie Kennedy. Just a single week after her husband was murdered, she gives this incredibly famous interview. And in it, she very deliberately, very carefully framed JFK's presidency as Camelot. From the musical, a brief, shining moment of perfection. Now, she was trying to shape his legacy, but what she also did, maybe without realizing it, was turn the Kennedys into American royalty. And that created the perfect stage for a tragedy of mythic proportions. Because, after all, who gets cursed? Kings and queens. But the person who really poured gasoline on this fire was Ted Kennedy, the youngest brother. In 1969, he's involved in this terrible incident at Chappaquiddick, where he drives his car off a bridge and a young woman, Mary Jo Kopechne, drowns. He gives this televised address to the nation, and right there, on live TV, he himself brings it up. He wonders aloud whether some awful curse did actually hang over all the Kennedys. He said the word, curse. And with that, it wasn't just some crazy theory in the papers anymore. It was official. It was now part of the Kennedy family's own narrative. All right, so let's take a step back and really peel back the layers of this myth. Is this really about some supernatural force? Or are there more logical, maybe more human explanations for this unbelievable string of bad luck? Because when you really dig into it, the whole supernatural curse thing starts to fall apart, and a much more complex reality comes into focus. So instead of a supernatural force, what you really see is a family culture that practically celebrated high-risk behavior. Instead of some tragic, unavoidable fate, you see the very real psychological toll that comes from one generation passing its trauma down to the next. And instead of some big cosmic injustice, well, you see the simple, cold hard laws of math and large numbers. You know, a huge part of why we even believe in this curse is a little psychological trick our brains play on us called confirmation bias. It's super simple. We pay attention to all the stuff that confirms what we already think, and we totally ignore everything that contradicts it. So we focus on the shocking Kennedy tragedies because they fit the curse story perfectly, but we completely forget about the dozens of other Kennedys who've lived long, healthy, and pretty normal lives. And that brings us to a really crucial point: scale. Just think about the numbers for a second. Joe and Rose Kennedy had 9 kids, and those 9 kids had a total of 30 grandchildren. When you have a family that massive, spread out over almost 100 years, the statistical chances of multiple tragedies happening, they don't just go up, they skyrocket. It's almost a mathematical certainty. And that ties directly into another huge factor: this intense, win-at-all-costs culture that was drilled into them from the time they were kids. Let's look at the facts. Joe Jr. volunteered for a bombing mission that was so dangerous other pilots had flat out refused to do it. Michael Kennedy died playing a reckless game of ski football. I mean, come on. JFK Jr. decided to fly his plane at night over water in hazy conditions he wasn't trained for. This isn't fate. This is a clear pattern of risky, sensation-seeking behavior where it seems like the normal rules of, hey, maybe this is a bad idea, just didn't apply. And behind that famous image of youthful energy and health was a hidden world of pain. President Kennedy, the guy who looked like a movie star, was secretly suffering from debilitating Addison's disease and chronic, agonizing back pain. I mean, get this. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, one of the most stressful moments in human history, he needed multiple injections every single day just to be able to function. The pressure to seem perfect, to seem invincible, was just immense. So, if we tossed out the idea of a supernatural curse, what are we actually left with? What is the real story here? I think when you boil it all down, it's a story about the absolutely staggering price of ambition. Because here's the thing: when you look at the entire sprawling story of this family, the most remarkable thing isn't actually the tragedy. It's their resilience. Think about it. Despite losses that would have shattered most families, they never, ever retreated from public life. They always came back. They always returned to public service. In fact, more often than not, they took that grief and transformed it into action. Eunice Kennedy Shriver, inspired by the secret tragedy of her sister Rosemary, went on to found the Special Olympics. Robert F. Kennedy's children have carried on his fight for human rights all around the globe. And Patrick Kennedy, after very public struggles of his own, channeled that experience into becoming one of the most powerful advocates for mental health in the country. They literally turned their trauma into a force for good in the world. And that really brings us to the final question. The big takeaway here. What if we've been telling this story completely backwards the whole time? What if the Kennedy curse isn't really a story about death and doom at all, but instead, it's the incredible story of a family that, no matter how hard they get hit, no matter what the world throws at them, simply refuses to quit?